Today is a very exciting day. So it's the 4-year GDPR anniversary. And I'd like to take this moment to welcome you all to our Tech That Talks special edition GDPR anniversary. So let's start. Dark patterns or privacy strategies, which aren't entirely legally compliant, are being found throughout companies. These, which are caused by malicious designs, are increasingly being exposed, and thus a growing number of transparency-enhancing technologies are being created to support the rights of data subjects, and legislation globally is placing a strong focus on how to be GDPR compliant. But we can only devise and implement overarching data protection by design if we become able to anticipate trends, explore the future implications of technology, and guide its development towards desirable outcomes. In the end, which brighter worlds do we intend to ensure and to design fair, transparent, human-centered use of personal data? Privacy must be obtained in a special manner, and for this, special considerations must be taken into account. Today, we will talk about concepts such as privacy engineering and privacy by design with 3 expert speakers from the public and private sectors that spend most of their time doing just this, pulling out the crystal ball and anticipating forward trends in data privacy. So today, on the global day of GDPR, we're going to explore how GDPR has evolved and where it's anticipated to be headed since 2018. But first, I'd like to take this moment to introduce our speakers for today. We have Paula Sipier, who joins us as EU policy lead from Palantir, and who has an exciting career in the intersection of privacy engineering, legal compliance, and government affairs. So quite the interesting mix. We also have Nishant Baharia as privacy architect at Uber, and also author of a very important and relevant book, which is Data Privacy, a Runbook for Engineers. And Alessandro Ortalla, which is an anticipatory compliance researcher and researcher at the Brussels Policy Hub, focusing on digital identity and privacy. So thank you everyone for being here today and our guests for tuning in. As always, have your questions ready and feel free to use the small panel box on the Zoom webinar technology today. Can't wait to hear those questions, and we'll get to them towards the end of our panel. Thank you, everyone. So let's start. I'd like to start with a general introduction towards anticipatory compliance and the role of privacy by design here. Kind of like to introduce the idea of thinking ahead of the curve for GDPR in a privacy strategy, and then we can delve into 2 more detailed questions surrounding this for our viewers who don't exactly know what privacy by design or privacy engineering might be. So I don't know who'd like to start. Maybe Paula, you can start.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you so much for having me on the panel as well. Very exciting topic. I remember actually, I joined Palantir, for which I currently work, just in the transition period to the GDPR, and I remember all the anxiety that companies had, to what extent they were prepared for the GDPR and to what extent they would have to change their operations. And I think at the time, this was a topic that generated a lot of anxiety, essentially. I think like now increasingly, the GDPR is also seen as something that can encourage a company, so to speak, to clean up the house. This is how like one data protection officer described it to me, because essentially, in order to be able to meet constantly evolving regulatory requirements, particularly across jurisdictions where they might not always overlap exactly, right? I think like one important part of this is to have a comprehensive overview over your data processing, right? So you can essentially know where sensitive data resides, like between which countries data is flowing, which I think is an increasingly important aspect also of compliance, and basically how to structure your data operations accordingly. This requires you, again, to on the one hand have a comprehensive overview of your processing, but on the other hand to granularly manage this, right? And I think this granular cross-jurisdictional data management will be an increasingly important topic to look out for.
Thank you, Paula. And how might we anticipate these emerging trends in order to prevent risks and development and drive the development of data-driven services?
Is that a question for any of us, Jessica?
Yes, that's a question for someone who would like to jump in. So to anticipate these exactly.
So I can jump in, yeah. So just a gentle correction. So my last name is Bajaria, the J is pronounced. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit. Okay. Yeah, so I think when it comes to detecting these trends, it's not going to happen in one fell swoop. I think what Paula made is a very good point. Like there are differences in tech stacks across the board. differences in data processing across different units of a company. So I think these trends will only be detected with the passage of time. So, and I think that is partly the outcome of the sheer volume of data and tech debt that companies bring to the table. What we are now looking at is how do you use GDPR as sort of a stepping stone to understand, how do we put controls in place? How do we do inventory of our data? How do we detect the lineage of the data? How do we understand processing and sharing? How do we understand the risk behind identification even after anonymizations of techniques are put into place? So once you do all of those things, you hopefully end up in a place where you will avoid building up that kind of tech debt again. One of the reasons why GDPR was seen as such a shock was because a lot of companies just weren't ready for it. Like they were ready in a compliance frame of mind, but they were not ready from an engineering frame of mind, right? So hopefully as things go forward, you can now understand how do different units across the company do this work? How does that vary across industries? How does that vary across countries? And then you can use GDPR as sort of, I would say, an excuse to build the internal engineering frameworks to ensure that you can now not just have these controls in place from a checkbox perspective, but make that a way of doing business, weave that into your business in terms of how you handle data. So as an example, when data enters your company, you put into place all the policies, all the categorization at the very beginning when the size of the data is the smallest. And then that will help you build these trends on a going forward basis rather than have to look back. Because I don't want people to think of GDPR as this big burden because it was such a big law. GDPR was seen as a heavy lift because companies hadn't done the right thing for too long while collecting all this data across the board without having any obligations across different teams who are operating on their own whims.
Okay, and thank you for that, Nishan. And when we're talking about looking at specific amounts of, or looking at the kind of data that people are collecting, this might be one of the focal points. So zooming in on these focal points, what might these, besides that, what might these emerging trends be in any given industry? So for companies, maybe looking at Uber, but then also on a more policy level. So Alessandra, maybe you can have something to say here. And also for clients such as by Palantir, what might these emerging trends be?
So first of all, I would like to go back to your first question, Jessica. So kind of an introductory to what we are basically talking about. What is anticipatory compliance, especially in the context of data protection and privacy. And well, I will start. I will be the academic of the group, of course, and I will start by saying, sorry?
That's what you're here for.
So, and I will start by saying something very academic, that is, well, the meaning of anticipatory compliance, it depends. It depends from the context, it depends to whom you ask about, it depends on the point of view. Now the complexity of these item, let's put it like that, is that it is a relatively new concept. But both my fellow panelists actually mentioned something really interesting that could help us to put anticipatory compliance in perspective and already see two different interpretations of anticipatory compliance. The first one is about what we could say it's an horizontal dimension. Okay, so they mentioned requirements, different geographical legal requirements spanning from different geographies. For instance, states X has certain legal requirements, state Y has certain legal requirements, and if your organization working in both of these countries, you have to comply to both. Okay, they mentioned also legal requirements of different sectors. So the first thing that we can identify anticipatory compliance is a horizontal and internal dimension. So I'm an organization and I work in a specific state or in a specific sector. Okay, can I already now anticipate in foreseeable future what are going to be other countries or other sectors that I will move into? Of course, this is very common in private companies and organizations to have these kind of forecasting exercises, but the interpreting these, using these as a key to interpret what are going to be the legal requirements I will be required to comply with, that's could be interpreted as a meaning for anticipatory compliance. Another way to see that could be, okay, I am state X and today I have these legal requirements. Can I anticipate, can I foresee how in the future legal requirements might emerge or change in context, geographies, and sectors where I already operate. So these are, broadly speaking, two ways to define the anticipation aspect of this term, anticipatory compliance. At least in my opinion. I would be curious to hear what the other panelists think about that.
Thank you, Alessandro. And Nishan, in your book, for example, you talk a lot about the intersection between engineering and then also a privacy strategy and the relevancy about these two aspects. So could you tell us a little bit more about maybe adding on to what Alessandro has just said, in kind of anticipating these forward trends and what a company can do, or where the privacy strategy should place its focus within a company?
Yeah, I think that's a great point Alessandro made when it comes to anticipatory compliance. I think what really happens is when you look at the policy description, and I see a lot of this in GDPR as well, these statements are made assuming that the decisions around privacy can be made very, very quickly or very, very, in a very comprehensive fashion, and they really cannot. The decision-making pyramid has been significantly inverted. You're basically looking at a world where engineers make several minor decisions in terms of what they collect, who they share data with, who they expose an API with. So when an engineer makes a decision, they don't think that I'm going to egress data about 50 million customers. They basically say, I'm going to open an API that will make the data available to a third party very, very quickly or in a very defined aggregated format. What then happens is that data leaves the company, is then processed by somebody else, is then shared by somebody else. And then that leads to a significant level of customer impact. So there is a very significant difference in scale, where on the engineering side, the decisions are made across the board that are very, very small in number. And then those decisions add up to something consequential. So my answer remains, which is what I said in the book pretty early on, which is, let's make sure that you build privacy into the data. So the book was initially being discussed as privacy by design. And my response was, there is very little you can do to design the entire architecture that is just privacy focused, because the entire architecture across the company is split across different engineers, across different business lines, across different tech stacks. So what you want to do is embed privacy into the data and make sure that the label of privacy in the data corresponds to policies that are laid out across the company. So the decision should be made very early on in the process. And what I think the policy teams need to realize across the board is this notion where they can just come in and tell engineers what to do is simply not going to fly, because there are too many engineers that are too disconnected from each other. Mm-hmm. So I think what you want to do is the following. First, have an abstraction built about what exactly the company's privacy policy is going to be that is internal facing. And that should include GDPR, CCPA, et cetera. So rather than chasing after individual laws, you want to make sure that you're chasing after one comprehensive representation that would be the outcome of engineering, policy, and legal working together. Then you convert those into actually actionable engineering policies. Then you map those policies to the data based on the privacy risk assessed at the data level at the early collection stage. And then that tag is added to the data. So you identify the data, you tag the data from a privacy perspective, you map them to policies and apply those corrections at the point of ingest. So then those mappings will follow the data across the company's infrastructure. So that is the level at which you want to operate across the board. And then hopefully, as I mentioned before, all the tech that people paid because of GDPR should essentially serve as an instruction for the way going forward.
And maybe if I can just add to that as well, because I think there were a couple of really important points there in what Nishan was saying. I think the data lineage one is an extremely important one, right? That you have an effective system for labeling data, right, and the nature of the data at your intake, and that you track how that data is processed over time and for what purposes as well. But then also trying to move away to a certain extent, at least from individual laws, and try to identify and abstract what the overarching principles might be, right? And I think one overarching principle in data protection law, which ultimately also sort of reflects social expectations, right, is that there's an expectation and legal requirement to only process personal data to the extent that it's necessary and proportionate to achieve a legitimate processing purpose, right? But in order to get there, like, you need to be able as a company to define in each sort of like working area, what is the processing purpose, right? And what was the legal basis for which you collected the data. I think like what we often witness is that companies, organizations might have inadequate documentation of data, right? So like they might not be able to comprehensively understand anymore at the end, like on what basis they collected the data for in the beginning, right? And then I think there's also a lot of insecurity when it comes to changes and the potential changes in the purpose of processing down the road, right? Whether this can still be considered compatible with the original purpose for which the data was collected. All of this requires you to have very granular and disciplined kind of like documentation practices and data labeling practices and tracking practices like in your organization. I think this can break down relatively easily if you don't engage with engineering teams from the beginning, right, and set up like a workable data infrastructure that gives you the flexibility later on to like regroup data or again, like reflect like why did you actually originally collect that data, for what purpose, like what was the legal basis, and can you regroup the data like later on, like is that actually compatible, or do you need to think about other ways, potentially also like just like reducing the identifiability of data if you don't need to work with personal data, right? So like what are the overarching principles that are likely going to be the same, and how can you make sure that you continue living up to those principles as the regulatory environment changes?
Thank you, Paul. And I think that this goes back to what you said at the very beginning, that the most important focal points here are the overarching view of what type of data is being collected, and then also the granularity. And in order to be able to granularly state for what reasons we are actually collecting data. In your practice, have you seen that organizations perhaps are collecting too much data, not enough clean data, and that this is actually a problem, especially later along the line when a relevant privacy strategy is trying to be implemented within an organization?
I mean, what I can say is that I think oftentimes, and this is also like why this conversation is so important, I think oftentimes there's a lack of an awareness perhaps as to what technical functionality is actually available today to enable you to like process data more at a more granular level, right? I mean, like we're a B2B business, like we don't collect or process or store customer data for our own purposes, right? We're not involved in like the collection side. But I think like when it comes to processing data downstream, there's oftentimes and I want to say like under complex impression with regards to how granularly you can actually like manage access to data, even at a sub data set or like data point level, right? Because it might be in certain professions, in certain contexts that access controls in and of itself, like, you know, might not give you the granularity that you could actually already achieve today with regards to processing data, right? Like there might be a situation where you need to have access to a data set in general, but you don't need to have all the level of granularity with regards to individual data points, right? So like one example that I like to use in this context is a call center, right? Like let's say you work for a telecommunications agency and you have somebody calling in because you have an issue with the line. When that person calls in, obviously you need to like verify the identity. But perhaps there are things that can be done on the phone that the customer can resolve whatever is going on with this line without needing to reveal, say, like their address or something, right? So like within the data set of the customer, like you might be able to arrange it such that only certain data is available to you off the bat, unless you request further access to further details in the data because you need it, let's say because you need to send in an agent to that address. So you actually need to see that information as well. There are different like layers of protections you can build in within existing data sets to really make sure that you limit access to different layers of identifiability based on purpose. And I think here there's a lot of communication that still needs to be done. Like, yes, it is possible, like these technical means are available. But basically like there needs to be an investment at the company level to recognize, okay, this is valuable. And it's actually going to be helpful for us to do processing in a more focused way, whether it's for privacy or business purposes, right? Like there's no contradiction there.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about technical means and also, like you just said, the investment for companies in this area, user trust plays a big role here. User trust is seen as a valuable commodity for companies, of course, and that has a lot to do with privacy and data collection. So you talked a little bit about the technical means. Could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of which technical means are currently available and where companies should go in order to facilitate more user trust? For example, user-centric, so our company, we have a CMP, and then there's also a lot of other technological means. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
I can talk a little bit more, but I think Nishan actually had raised his hand, so like maybe, and I imagine like he has a lot to say on this topic as well.
Nishan, you can also jump in whenever you want. But we can't hear you, so you'll have to unmute first.
So I know I do need to unmute first. Yeah, so I can start with a specific example. I think Paula made an excellent point about right-sizing collection. I think what happens in a lot of companies is that people just don't understand the sheer volume of data they are collecting. So as an example, if the data comes in as what is known as unstructured data, you don't always know what's inside it. Is it IP addresses? Is it device ID? Is it location information? Is it telemetry? It's very, very hard to understand what's in there. And because a lot of engineers usually find something in that blob of data that they can use, the expectation is let's collect everything and we will delete it later on. The fact that the two most dangerous words in privacy and security are later on, because you always assume that somebody else downstream will clean the data up for you. So there is often this complacency that somebody else can take care of the data for you that causes companies to get into trouble. And this is why my parents often ask me, how do companies with very, very smart people have all these security and privacy issues? Like, how is it that companies that produce all these amazing products don't get privacy and security right? And that's because the things that you incentivize to get product development right are the exact opposite things you need to get privacy right sometimes. So don't worry about the details, move fast and break things. Like, these are things that help you when it's time to ship amazing things without a ton of process. But these same things bite you in the backside when it comes to actual data privacy. The second thing I would say is there is often a difference in vocabulary. So to Paula's point, like when attorneys and policy people ask engineers, did you delete this data? And the engineers say yes, the engineers often mean that the data is not really deleted, it's encrypted, or the data is disconnected from the identifiable portion of the data, or the data is stored in some sort of tokenized database, or is aggregated. So there is often a lack of awareness and a lack of incentive to create awareness. That's point number one. And second, there is often a lack of consistent definitions across different parts of the company. So that answers the first part of the question. When it comes to the technical means, I think making sure that you apply security techniques to actual data protection is pretty critical. So you can use encryption tools, you can use tokenization tools, you can use actual data destruction, you can use aggregation. So there are a lot of technical tools, but I would say, rather than honing in on the technical tools themselves, it's important to understand what you have, like Paula said in the very first question. And second, how exactly have you handled the data, making sure the definitions are consistent.
And translating between business units as well, right? Like, I think like the getting, like, a lawyer says deletion and an engineer understands like a lot can go wrong if you don't elaborate, for sure. Sorry, Anna.
No, I really like the Nishan's example from his parents asking, okay, how is that even possible that all these, multi-billion companies fail at this basic thing? And I think this example fits nicely with the question from Jessica about trust and how you build trust with your customers, with your users, and how you maintain trust, and basically how GDPR can be used as a trust enabler or trust enhancer. And if you look in the GDPR, right now we are in the habit of considering data processing like you need to process some data, you send out some previous notice and consent form, you collect consent, which is usually like tens of pages of legal wording that people usually don't understand or do not have time to read. And then you expect people to just click yes, and then, okay, I have consent, I can process data. Well, hold your horses, is not exactly like that. First of all, we could actually debate if this practice as it is, it's compliant with the GDPR, because in a sense it violates certain aspects of the principle of transparency. But this is maybe a thing for another panel. But the point is that in the GDPR, you have mentions, you have provisions that actually tell you, okay, when you try to collect consent, and here consent is just an example, when you are collecting consent, you have to, do your best to make it easy for the user to understand what he or she is consenting to. And there are different ways to do that. I mean, there are projects right now from universities. They're trying to, for instance, create standardized design template and an icon set that can be used to create some sort of standardized consent notice that do not use as many words as we are used to see right now, but relies on visual aid. There are, layered consent practice. There are many things. You can use audio visual material to, inform users. there is so much room for creativity here, and organizations, they usually just stick to the usual because it's easier, of course. I mean, just writing a document that you can copy paste for all of your users, basically, it's of course easier and less costly than creating like a video on YouTube that explain things. We understand that, but we should probably not say that GDPR is not fit for helping organizations to be creative, because GDPR is fit for doing that, in my opinion, at least.
And maybe just to add one additional point, because I think it draws a nice bridge back to user trust as well. First of all, I agree, the GDPR is an enormous source of creativity, right? In a positive sense, right? Because it's spurring a lot of innovation in privacy engineering too. And I think one amazing side effect of the GDPR as well was that all of a sudden, privacy has become a topic that board members engage with that might not naturally be interested in this topic, right? It has definitely raised the profile of this whole field to an entirely new level. And I do think it's encouraging a vast number of interesting existing companies, but also startups to invest in new ways to be able to manage data in a more granular way, right? But I think when it comes to such genuinely challenging topics as how to collect or provide meaningful consent as well, right? I think here there are two aspects to this. One of them obviously is clarity of communication. Obviously there's a whole academic literature side right around the complexities of meaningfully communicating information in a way that the user can digest. And I think we are all used to also just clicking our way through consent notices without really reading them, right? I think that's a reality, because otherwise we just spend hundreds of years just reading these things. But I mean, because of this reality, I think there's also an obligation on companies to precisely not design consent collection in a way that is deliberately misleading, right? And here I think also there's a healthy interaction to be made between, let's say, a legal team that's strictly looking at the legal requirements, perhaps more a policy-oriented person, or even somebody with an ethics background, right? I mean, I myself have a background, I was in a PhD, working together with a philosopher in applied ethics, right? Thinking more about what are the social expectations around privacy, right? And here as well, I think there's some very basic principles that go beyond the law, in the sense of what are the reasonable expectations of a user when he engages with your service, right? What are the context specific expectations of the area in which you're operating, right? When I go to the hairdresser, I expect that my hair will be cut. I don't expect my washing machine to be repaired. This is kind of a banal example, but I think some of the most jarring privacy violations have been when people provided their data for one purpose, but then for all of a sudden they realized it was used for something completely different, right? So making sure also as a company that you design these things in a context sensitive way is extremely important, and that applies across jurisdictions. Is more an interhuman level, less than, I mean, it's obviously reflected in the law, but I think there's an additional level to this that's important to remember.
And
it's a great question, because so you were saying?
No, sorry, Nishant. These are the dark patterns that we're seeing all the time. And it's precisely these that are breaking down user trust, which is costly on a ethics perspective, but also on a business perspective. And Nishant, sorry, you can go on.
It's okay. So I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding about GDPR, where for some people, it's going to be the be all end all, the savior that's going to protect us all from any privacy violations on the one side. Or for the other side, people think it's this completely ineffectual, feckless, useless law. I think GDPR is the beginning of conversation. It's not the be all end all. And I think the tragedy here is that I had hoped when GDPR became official 4 years ago this week, that it would be the beginning of a conversation that would have policy institutes, government institutes, and companies come together and create a follow-up version that will lead to a whole generation of engineers that will build these tools that will then implement GDPR and make it essentially the default way of doing business. Instead, what has happened is it has spawned off a whole bunch of bespoke implementations, tools, and things like that. So what I think GDPR was meant to do is provide a framework for, here is an expectation of privacy, here's an expectation of how to do business, and here's what tooling for that would look like. That was the beginning of GDPR. But what has instead happened is that the people who are sympathetic to GDPR have now taken to defend it with the passion of zealots and converts, while the people who have to see GDPR as a hindrance dismiss it as a law that is not worthy of implementation. And to be frank, GDPR has several things in it that if you take them literally cannot be implemented. So the goal for GDPR 4 years ago, maybe I was a little too Pollyanna, was that it would essentially be seen as exactly what it is, which is the beginning of a conversation. And that's why I wrote the book, because I feel like what is really missing is a run book. What engineers need to protect GDPR in the company is something where they can take in their hands and say, let me understand what this actually means from a tool construction perspective. How do I build something that I can talk about with engineers, with attorneys, with policy persons, with product managers, with business leaders? What is missing is the connecting tissue, the common vocabulary, but also a set of clearly manageable, digestible instructions that you can then use to implement, and you can then use to essentially see how much progress have we made. If you cannot understand it, you cannot build it. If you cannot prove it, you cannot verify that it was done. And if you cannot improve it, it didn't happen. So I think being able to do these three things is pretty critical for engineers, and not just engineers, but anybody who runs a business. So I think my hope is that the book essentially spurs that conversation, but the next law that gets passed, whether it's a state law in the US, although I really do hope it's not another state law, I hope it's something that's a little more comprehensive, but whether it's whatever law it is something that connects policy, legal, and engineering together, because I think that's what GDPR is supposed to have spawned off.
Yeah, and Nishant, I completely agree with your point that GDPR is, a starting point. Maybe not a starting point, but let's say a turning point. I'm, by training, by education, first of all, I'm an historian. Okay, my first degree is in history, so I tend to look at things from, a detached point of view, like looking over longer period of times and how things are unfolding. And if you look at the context of privacy and data protection, well, certainly GDPR did not invent privacy, did not invent data protection, but it was a turning point in the discussion. And certainly there is, an evolution of the, of the arguments and things. So I agree with Nishant. The GDPR is not perfect. There are things that could be ameliorated. There are things that should be better understood by the people and the organization who should be in a position to, comply with GDPR requirements. But I see what I see is that we are going in that direction. We are building awareness every day, and I'm optimistic for the future, actually. And going back to one point from Paula, and also Nishant said it, the mention about the social expectation, that's a huge part of GDPR and, well, compliance in general. At the end of March, I think, we held with the Brussels Privacy Hub, we held a workshop with people from industry and academia, a workshop on anticipatory compliance. And the idea was precisely to sit down with experts, discuss this, concept, try to find a commonly agreed definition, work out ways to implement it. And one of the points that emerged is that for certain companies, especially, bigger companies, one of the most troublesome thing is to try to foresee, to anticipate how expectation, cultural and social expectations in regard to data protection and privacy will change. Because understanding this social expectation inform this company on how to best comply with legal requirements, especially in the case of GDPR, which is a principle-based norm, and as we said, leaves much freedom of experimenting and creativity. So when you do not have like strict boundaries between you have to move, but you have sort of flexibility, then you also have to take other things into consideration, like the social context in which you operate, and understanding how the context evolves through time. That is also another aspect of anticipatory compliance.
And maybe like one additional point, which I think is also interesting to see with regards to how to implement legal principles at a practical level. I think there's an important role for regulatory authorities to play there as well. Right? And I do think they, at least like some of them are like taking a more proactive stance now. I think I'd like to like point to, I mean, unfortunately not in the EU anymore, but still like the Information Commissioner's Office, right? Like they are currently in the process of revising their guidance around anonymization, right? Like anonymization best practices. And they also took up an approach where they encourage researchers, companies, interested parties to basically submit input and proposals to their chapters as well. What are some of the most common questions that come up in this context? I think this is a really good example of like regulatory bodies also trying to like issue more practical guidance about how do you implement it at a technical level, because this I think we witness quite often. And then I think we have complementary laws now also evolving, or regulations to the GDPR, for instance, like the EU AI Act, right? Where we also, I think, probably see kind of an evolution from the GDPR with regards to what does risk-based regulation actually look like, right? And what obligations are also imposed upon companies around like being very transparent and doing proactive risk assessments with regards to their data processing, right? I do have the feeling that new or evolving regulatory acts such as the EU AI Act already reflect some of the learnings from the GDPR, right? And try to like build upon them to further sort of like advance the law to reflect and respond to the challenges of the information age.
Yeah, talking about, Paula, talking about what supervisory authorities are doing, I think that prime example right now is what the EDPS is trying to build. The European Data Protection Supervisor is trying to build in terms of, you know, capacity and skills to anticipate changes. They recently kickstarted this new initiative. I think it's called Taxonar, which is basically a sort of a bulletin of, you know, new technologies, emerging technologies, and, you know, an analysis of the technology. And the rationale behind this analysis is precisely, okay, this technology, they are coming, okay, and when they will materialize in the mass market, when they will be a reality, most likely they will require organizations to comply with their complexity and to understand this technology through the lenses of the GDPR. So they will need to adjust their operations. But it is also the interesting part. It's also an internal exercise for the EDPS, because when this new technology will arrive, we, as the supervisory authority, we will be called upon to understand how organizations are complying to this new technology, to the requirement spanning from this new technology. So, you know, different organizations are involved in this anticipatory compliance exercise. They are doing foresight exercise to understand how to anticipate the changes. And certainly, I would say that the EDPS is very active in that. In Europe, also the French Data Protection Authority has a standing foresight capability inside its workforce. So anticipatory compliance, even if it's not, you know, precisely defined term, is certainly a very real practice that exists already, and that organizations in the field are already putting into practice.
Yeah. So if I may jump in here real quick, I think something that often gets missed in these conversations is incentives. I remember back in the day when I was at a very different company more than a decade ago, and the topic was, do we move to the cloud? There was a ton of resistance from in-house IT. And the first thing they said to us was, you know, this stuff isn't backed up locally, right? And our response was, for the engineers that were trying to move to the cloud, is that, yeah, that's kind of the point. We don't want this stuff backed up locally. We want it spread out across different geographic zones, so as to make sure there was some redundancy packed into the process, and that we could make sure that the organization was able to adapt in the event one data center went down. And I think the incentive structures were given to the engineers, saying that you will have less latency, more availability, less need to have to maintain the data centers yourselves. So it was essentially brought into practice with engineers understanding how it would benefit them. The organizations, whether they're in DC or Brussels or wherever, pushing privacy regulation, have to understand something very critical here. Unless they make it easier for engineers to implement this, unless they make an appeal to the engineers' incentives and how engineers can build better products, any amount of privacy regulation is not going to go anywhere. Because I can show you company after company that presents privacy and security and trust as its key values, But when it comes time to prioritize, somehow those decisions end up below the cut line. They're always second best. And unless you're in the top critical priority, things don't get funded. And that's going to be especially critical in the next couple of years if we go into an economic contraction, when the pressure on margins will be pretty immense. So I think as we think about this going forward, I definitely appreciate the high-minded policy imperatives. I really do, and I believe in those. But I also live in the world of engineers across the board in all my ventures. And these decisions are made by engineers who understand the details in a way that their executives do not. These engineers who are able to make micro decisions that collectively add up to consequences in a way the attorneys do not. So you have to make sure that these laws and appeal to engineers. And honestly, there is a good story to tell here. That's what breaks my heart sometimes, that if you get privacy right, there is actual business benefit. If you reduce the size of data, there is less data to encrypt. If you shrink the size of data, there is less data that could potentially get egressed in the event of a breach. If you manage access control, the insider IP theft risk goes down. So anytime you do privacy right, there is benefit to the business. So I would basically reframe the laws in a way that benefit the engineers very directly and are not seen as an imposition or a burden. And the other thing is, the people who work purely in the policy space often speak to engineers with an air of, you engineers don't know how this works. We will pass the law and you figure it out. The actual conversation with engineers has to happen at the very beginning of the framing of the law itself. The engineers should not be the consumers of the law only. They should be the contributors to the law as well. So, and I recognize that may not play very well in some quarters, but practically speaking, unless the conversation follows that framework or something similar, you will not end up in a law that is then implemented and we can learn from. Because the final point I'll make is, when you go through the process of implementing GDPR or CCPA or CPR or LGPD, it is critical to do it in a way that you get some learnings to then write the next version of the law or to build the next generation of the tools. If your experiences for today don't give you learnings for tomorrow, then today has been a bit of a waste. So it is extremely critical that you make engineers part of this process, both in terms of creation and in terms of incentives. I know it's kind of a long answer, so hopefully that made sense.
And like in terms of implementation as well, right? Because I think like one thing that we also notice internally is that, I mean, we are passionate about the GDPR, right? Like we care about privacy. Not everybody is as excited about this, right? Like some people might hear GDPR, they might think like, oh, like another law, another like compliance obligation, like another kind of like slide deck I have to flip through like once a year to like sort of like tick the box that I reviewed like the annual policies or whatever. I think there's an obligation, like, you know, like an interesting like new like field to explore for companies to really reach a stage where people are actually excited and like think about like laws like the GDPR as like an incentive for like innovation or to like work on something interesting, right? Like one thing that we experimented with last year is that on the occasion of International Data Privacy Day at the end of January, we basically defined a theme for the year that we would organize different activities around, like company-wide, right? So like last year, the theme that we chose was privacy by design and default. So what we basically also did is that we organized these workshops where we would bring people together from the business development side, so people who work in a very customer-facing way, with the product development side. And we looked at our platforms, and we looked at different applications in those platforms. We basically reviewed them from a privacy by design and default perspective, right? Like we communicated, like we had an exchange, like what does it actually mean to build privacy into your products by design? Like what are some of like the legal frameworks, like what are some of like the case studies where this has been done well or not well? And then we workshopped individual applications like in a very hands-on fashion, right, to see how we can do better, right? We spun Hack Week projects out of this. So instead of this, like the GDPR being this like slide deck that you flip through, we actually involved product development with the support of business development who can actually express that this is important to customers as well, right, to improve our products. And all of a sudden it became an interesting engineering project as opposed to like a compliance burden, right? And I mean, like here it was like very important as well for the business development side to communicate, like our customers want this, right? Like this is not like a barrier to business. It's the only thing that will enable you to do business nowadays, right? Like, you know, like when we work as processors as well, right? Like one important aspect is that your customers, like the controllers of the data, will not be able to work together with you unless you are able to demonstrate that you provide all the functionalities, right, that will enable the person determining the purpose of processing to process that data in a compliant way. So you need to sort of like ramp it up and provide these functionalities, otherwise you will be out of business at some point, right? So like taking it as a competitive edge and communicating this internally as well and getting engineers excited about this profession is an important aspect of this puzzle as well, in my opinion.
Your,
sorry.
I will be very, very quick. Your example, Paula, actually, connects again with what you said before about, the expectations and how these are important aspects of compliance, because it is true what you said. Whenever there is a new law, whenever there is a new regulation, policy officers, compliance officers in organizations, they raise their eyebrow and say, oh my God, again, another exercise of compliance that I have to tick every year, whatever. But with the GDPR and privacy in particular, this is even inflated due to societal expectation, because while, for instance, some sort of anti-fraud or financial regulation are something that are familiar only within the boundaries of organizations and maybe experts, privacy and data protection are something that we all as users have to deal with. Whenever you go on a website and you're asked to, agree on the privacy notice, cookie, banner, terms of services, or whatever, every time this builds, some sort of privacy fatigue. And, the same person that builds privacy fatigue are then the person that in organization have to, tick the compliance box. So I think that for GDPR, this is even worse. And maybe one way to make everything easier is to, first of all, start to find ways to lower the privacy fatigue of individuals in the society as a whole. And then start from that to address how GDPR can become an added value for organization, but after this mandatory for me point.
Thanks, Alessandro. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time right now. We're seeing the influx of human-centered design, of legal, and from foresight and anticipatory compliance all come together. And I'm witnessing that within my own firm at Usercentrics as well. When you look at the amount of engineers and product and sales and business development and everyone and all of the work that goes in together, especially when we're looking at developing privacy solutions for applications. In the application world, a lot of creativity and privacy by design has to go in there. In order to have a privacy solution that really attracts users and that makes privacy easy for users and that builds up that user trust, so that we don't have people who are then just deleting the application. And we're hearing so many applications, especially when it comes to health apps and everything and children's apps, where users are just not feeling like their privacy is being respected. And that's really where you see the togetherness and the working together of the engineering and the product teams. I recently spoke with someone also from the AAPP, and they were saying that they're training all of their legal team with a technology background now, so that we can have like the next wave of laws come in with a more IT background and IT focus. So it's really interesting to see where GDPR is going and to see how that's been being formed now. I have a couple of questions. So I have a question from someone from our audience, from Susan Clausing. And the question is, GDPR deals with personal data and the new EU AI Act with all kinds of data. But AI can also identify people through non-personal data, for example, profiling. To what extent does this create a tension between the areas of application of these regulations? And potentially, how does this apply to other upcoming regulation as well? I don't know if anyone would like to jump in.
Yeah, I do agree with the premise of the question, because identification of data is the key game here. Like if you make a whole bunch of changes, I think what I've criticized the people on the policy side, now it's time to turn fire upon my own fellow engineers, so I can annoy everybody equally. I think what often happens is engineers tend to confuse process for progress, where they will tell you, here's how much perturbation we added to the data. Here's how much aggregation we've done. What matters in the end is, are you able to re-identify the user or not? I'm being very, very oversimplistic here, but if the goal is to protect privacy and protect the data, you want to make sure that if a user has an expectation of being forgotten, that user is actually forgotten and that they are not re-identifiable. So I think coming up with deterministic methods like k-anonymity, L-diversity, to ensure that you can measure the risk of identification, measure cohort size, is very critical. And I'm not just suggesting this to add process, but this is important because you can on an ongoing basis identify what the size of the cohort needs to be, what the type of data is, what are the different points you can use for aggregation purposes? How do you measure the effectiveness of the data alongside the coarsening of data? Because there will be this debate where it's not just privacy versus the engineers and the marketers. It's privacy occasionally versus security, because security may want very, very precise data to identify a bot farm or somebody that's trying to DDoS the company, right? But from a privacy perspective, how do you know that's really a bot? How do you know that's really an attacker, right? So understanding what the identification risk is, who is it available to, who is it susceptible for, I think is extremely important, because otherwise you will end up in a situation where you won't understand what data to start with, but more importantly, you will actually make a lot of changes to the data that will worsen the quality of the data and piss off the engineering and machine learning teams without actually getting any privacy benefit. So I would rather be in a situation where there is privacy benefit to identification risk without hurting the engineers in a way that makes their life harder for no reason. So I think that measurement is pretty critical. So I love the question, simply because it hits upon a premise that too many people fail to appreciate until it's too late, until too many meetings have taken place. And then that is why privacy gets a bad name, because you start with an ambiguous goal without actually understanding how success is going to be measured at the end.
If I may jump in on the question from the audience, well, yes, it is true. There are overlaps on subject matter of different regulations on data, and probably we are going to see more and more of these overlaps. So lawmakers and policymakers, they will have to scratch their head and find a way to create coherent architecture of data related regulation. And I give you just one example. The new eIDAS regulation, for instance, that is currently being worked in the EU. Now, the subject matter of the eIDAS regulation, which for anybody who is not familiar with that, is the digital identity framework regulation of Europe. So the subject matter is not personal data. Okay, it's what is called identity data. But of course, identity data has, as a concept, has a huge overlap with personal data. And we actually published a report with the Brussels Privacy Hub, and one of the issues that we identified in this regulation, in this draft, apologies, of the regulation, is that precisely there is no mechanism to regulate how situations in which you have an overlaps of regulation, in this case GDPR and eIDAS, would be solved. So going back to the question, yes, there are overlaps. There are going to be more overlaps, in my opinion, and this is probably something that we have to take a close look at, because in the future, with the multiplication of a law in the related to data and digital economy in general, this is likely to become an added complexity especially for lawmakers.
Thank you, Alessandro, for your insights on this. I also have another question that I think is quite relevant for our audience to have a better understanding. So if whatever would like to jump in, which hurdles are challenging for an organization to come in your experience? Where have you seen the largest hurdles lie in order to solidify a strong privacy strategy? So where should the most focus be, if you could just give one tip to our audience?
I would say metrics. Find a way to measure success, because otherwise you will lose momentum pretty quickly, especially considering how front-loaded the privacy work is going to be for a lot of companies that haven't done this before. Come up with numbers, come up with examples, anecdotes that demonstrate what works and what doesn't. Bring the engineers along with you, bring the board of directors along with you. So the more metrics you have, the better, so as to appeal to the widest possible audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, adding to this, going back from when I was working as a consultant, what I saw with my customers is that two things basically are, the most complex things for organization. One is precisely what Nishant said. It's about metrics, measuring things, but not only in terms of how do I measure my performance versus a regulation, but also how do I measure potential added value that comes from complying with the regulation. So if I am fully compliant to the GDPR, does this increase the number of customers because, I'm a more trustful organization. This is one thing that board members, considers very, very closely, actually. And another, problem, but this is, traditional for every change in every organization, is the human problem. It's like, how can you convince people to change their habit towards something new and to convince them that doing this might bring value?
Thank you, Alessandro. And now briefly, let's talk about privacy impact assessment. So this is also a very relevant part of any organization, a privacy strategy. What are the benefits of conducting a PIA even when a project does not meet the high privacy risk threshold? And what are the benefits of conducting one on the privacy of individuals and of the company? I don't know if anyone would like to jump in.
I mean, I can start. I think there are a couple of questions that are posed right at the beginning of a privacy impact assessment that are relevant for all kind of processing, right? Particularly in light of the fact that it might become increasingly difficult to distinguish between personal and non-personal data, right? The fact that laws are very quickly evolving, and the fact that it's just exceptionally helpful to have a comprehensive overview as to what is going on in your company, so you can sort of target your resources in the most effective way, right? So I think those questions essentially are at the beginning. It's like, what kind of data, right, are you processing for what kind of purpose, under what legal framework? And what are you trying to achieve in the end, right? Who needs access to this data to achieve that purpose, right? These are data protection relevant questions, but they're also business relevant questions, right? So such that you can basically allocate people and resources appropriately. So I think there's a documentation and sort of internal rigidity aspect of this, just being disciplined about how are you spending your resources? Are you spending them appropriately? And are you managing data in a way that is granular enough to actually achieve those purposes? Like the beginning couple of questions of any privacy impact assessment, I think, are always extremely helpful, right? They could be relevant for information security purposes too. So I'm a big fan of privacy impact assessments.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone would like to add anything on this.
Yeah, I would say front loading some of those be helpful. Don't wait until the end. Work with engineers to come up with a program where you can detect the most problematic, potentially, or ambitious initiatives of the company and identify those issues beforehand. That will educate the engineers, it will educate the attorneys and build those bridges. Otherwise, there is a risk that the privacy impact assessments that come at the end of the funnel may either have to be too shallow or may slow the engineers down and create friction. So anything you can do to spread the pain around in a way that is used to educate engineers and reduce risk would be helpful.
I think basically summing up today is start at the beginning with any privacy strategy. It's very, very important. Do not wait when it's too late, because it just adds unnecessary costs to any organization.
Exactly.
Well, Nishan, Alessandro, and Paula, thank you so much for your insights today. We are running out of time, so thank you for answering all the questions. And it was a very interesting and insightful conversation today on our GDPR anniversary. Exciting to see where everything's going and where legislation's headed. So thank you very much. And I hope to see everyone on the next Tech That Talks next month.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.